This is Thesis Svensson.
All right, good morning. So as Professor Richter said, my name is Thesis Svensson, and I would like to start off my presentation by first thanking my committee, Professor Hurd, Professor Eisenbach, and Professor Ambrose, for all their support and guidance this semester. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped me, and I'd especially like to thank my mom for her support and her strength. Without her, I wouldn't be here today, and I certainly wouldn't be covering this topic. And so, this thesis is titled, Preparing for Life After Homelessness, Homelessness to Transitional Housing. This thesis explores a state of homelessness that provides a transition from homelessness to independent living. Homelessness is a state to recover from. It's not a problem that we're looking to fix. The goal of this project is to demonstrate the needs of the homeless, is to demonstrate how services are best provided, how they can be best sited, and how best we can integrate programs and facilities with not only the needs of homeless people, but with the surrounding community. And so, today, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development defines homelessness as when a person resides in a place described below, a place not meant for human habitation, emergency shelters, supportive housing after incarceration, hospitalization, someone who has been evicted with their residence and has no subsequent support, or someone who's fleeing domestic violence and again has no subsequent support. Today in the United States, there are over 600,000 homeless people. Of those people, only 200,000 are receiving supportive housing. They are broken up into individuals, we have homeless families, we have unaccompanied youth, and we have veterans today without housing. Over the years, our view of homelessness has changed. In the 1930s, we began with what we labeled the Depression homeless. These were single men, these were people who were evicted, there was a lack of work and economy. At this point, what we had the romanticized wanderer. From the 40s to the 70s, we had what was the Skid Row era of the old homeless. We still had a number of single men who were without work, who lacked a home. They lived in flop houses, SROs, and single-room occupancies. Starting in the 1980s with the Reagan era and continuing today, we have what is considered the new homeless. Starting with the shutdown of mental institutions and other supportive facilities, we suddenly had women, children, and minorities who were becoming homeless. So what causes homelessness today can be considered loss of job, loss of employment, financial instability, violence, prison sentences, disabilities. We even have environmental disasters. And so when we lose our homes, we lose our community, we lose our stability, safety, and we lose our ability to be financially stable. So today we have emergency shelters, transitional housing, and supportive housing for our homeless. We do have a series of programs in place. So, transitional housing looks at programs of living arrangements combined with social services. I came to this project because I myself was homeless. Between my junior and my senior year of college here at the University of Maryland, my family and I one summer, we were fleeing domestic abuse. We packed up the dog, we packed up what we could in the bags we could carry. We lived in a hotel for a month. We moved from room to room. We took turns deciding who slept on the sofa, who slept on the bed, and who slept on the floor on couch cushions. And we came off, we started with a set amount of money. We had enough to support ourselves for a while. But as the money began to run out, our crisis became worse. We were afraid we were going to end up in emergency shelters. We were afraid we were going to be split up. And so I remember the entire time, why wasn't there someplace we could go to get help? Why couldn't someone tell us what the best move was or where to find housing? Sure, we had a lawyer, but we didn't have the rest of the aid we needed. And so that was how I came in my research of this thesis and approaching the concept of homelessness to transitional housing. And so today, transitional housings usually last a program of anywhere from a few months to 2 years, in which case there's the movement from being homeless to incoming members spending 1 to 4 months going through a stabilization process. There's a moment of where stabilization and education occurs, programs are met, and then there's program completion and aid in finding permanent housing. And so my question then for transitional housing was, how does it deal with the loss of home and creating a place where needs are met? These needs, if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, include physical and biological needs, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. The homeless may at most achieve physical and biological needs. There's a little bit of safety, there's some food. However, it is only through housing that we have the chance to achieve safety and the rest of our emotional and psychological needs. And so then what is home? Home is created by place, is created by memories, is created by the objects that hold those memories and the people we make those memories with. And so transitional housing, as you'll see in my project, focuses on how we can combine housing, services, community, and transition in a place and a space that we create. Today, there's a separation of communities between those who are housed and those who are homeless. We are aware of each other. We understand that we have services in place, but those who are housed tend to turn their backs. And so what I am proposing is that we bring these communities together through interactive spaces. And by having these socializing spaces and creating porosity, we can begin to destigmatize the state of homelessness. We can begin to stitch back communities that both require aid. We all have needs that need to be met. So in my research then, I looked at a number of different types of supportive housing. It ranged from transitional housing to permanent housing to even how we treat our elderly today and give them supportive housing. And so the criteria was looking at food services, social services, education, healthcare, work, and community, and how we create those through spaces. This example looks at Peter Zumthor's residential home for the elderly and how they share a common front porch. So, in approaching, I looked at the state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore. Baltimore currently has over 2,000 homeless, closer to 3. This is a state of a city where we have gentrification, we have a lack of employment and jobs, we have a lack of investment. However, through the gentrification, we're trying to bring new people to this city. So how does a city that wants to bring new residents deal with the current residents who are determined to stay, who have made their home? And how do you give them the assistance they need? So I began by looking at which neighborhoods had the highest homeless populations. And I came to the neighborhood of Harlem Park. So Harlem Park is located right up above Route 40. For those of you to create a little context, the Sandtown Winchester riots are located right in the neighborhood above. In fact, the caravan that was carrying Freddie Gray stopped at this corner right here between the neighborhood of Upton, Sandtown Winchester, and Harlem Park. And so Harlem Park is an interesting neighborhood because it can be compared to the way people become homeless on their own. This is a neighborhood that has seen flight, it has seen disinvestment, it has seen crisis. It has also seen aid brought to it in the form of the Harlem Park Demonstration Project, where, in an attempt to create better community, the inner alleys were demolished of their alley houses, and instead public parks were put in. Currently, 40 to 50% of residents 16 to 64 are not working. We have up to a 30% vacancy of homes on the site. In talking with the community and researching, a lot of what I heard was saying that they needed amenities, they needed help, they needed a place, and they needed work so that they could get their young men off the street and get them employed, give them the education they deserve. So Harlem Park has existing communities. There are a number of schools. There's a strong community of churches and congregations. We have public spaces. We have multifamily and some subsidized housing. And so we then also have the community of parks. And so the intervention site is right here, located by Fremont Avenue, Harlem Avenue, and West Lombard Street. And so looking at current conditions, we have a very residential street. off of Lonval Street. Fremont Avenue is lined with churches and businesses, and Harlem Avenue consists of a mixture of residential and commercial businesses. So then it was important to look at where are people actually living in this community. These are residents who throughout the blight and throughout the flight have decided to stay, so it was important to honor them. But it was also important to look at where we could intervene. And so buildings in black are buildings that I honored and decided to stay in the intervention. Lots are in blue and the vacant houses are in a darker green. And so I'd like to, the pink, these are vacant houses around and surrounding the community. And so one of the early ideas of this project was perhaps in transitioning people through this site, once they've completed the program of transitioning, they can perhaps move into these properties and invest in the community they've created. And so I'd like to welcome you to Harlem Park Mariposa House and Community. The program of this project looks at creating incubator retail along North Fremont Avenue. This provides opportunities for work for not only the community, but as well as residents. It gives them a chance to practice and learn a new occupation. We have supportive housing, which includes living units, childcare, common rooms so that people can have a chance to escape their living conditions, come together and create a community. Homeless people usually become very isolated, and so having the chance to socialize is important. We also have a dining hall and we have a daycare for the different residents' needs. Those who don't know how to cook now have the opportunity to use the kitchen and learn. Or if they don't have time while using the education center, can come in for a quick meal. Then we have social services, which includes a day room for those who perhaps just need a place to get away. We have therapy, we have case management, and we have health services. Then as part of the program and as part of the education and transitioning, we have education and community. So we have a library. The closest public library in Harlem to Harlem Park is 10 miles away. At most, residents have access to the libraries in the schools. We have an auditorium, we have classrooms, we have a job center. So as I stated before, the communities couldn't stress enough how much they needed to get their young men off the streets, how they could give them the opportunity. And the same goes for the homeless residents of Mariposa House. We have included in the library system, we have little places where people can come to study. They can get away. The teenager who's mad at mom and dad gets the chance to, just decompress, get out of the house. But they're still within the community and they're still somewhere safe. We also then have a gym, we have offices, and we have a number of workshops and workspaces. And so I'd like to walk you through a day in the life of an individual. So, say this is your first time you're coming off the streets, you're a homeless individual or family. You enter the site off of a public courtyard, and as you come in, you are greeted. You are shown that this is a secure place, and you're directed where to go, whether it's to therapy, to health care, whether it's to a case officer. And so there are moments throughout the building as we walk along a Gabian wall made of the, of the residue of buildings we've demolished. We have little moments where there's still interaction and porosity, but we have little enclosed incubator spaces. So depending then on whether you're a family, an individual, or wanting to live as a group, you are given your residence and you have access to the day rooms, the libraries. You have a common room for a shared space. One thing that was important in looking at how some of the units were created was the Baltimore culture of the front stoop. And looking at the concept of these courtyard parks as well. Interaction in Baltimore happens from front door to front door. And so for residents who are most acclimated and the furthest point into transitioning, or perhaps the most comfortable with integrating back into society, have units that face onto existing residences. There's that bit of interaction with the existing community. There's also, in making this space seem, excuse me, less institutional, incorporating the row house typology. And so the family will make use of the daycare services, the library. They have larger units. You can see a number of the 4 different grouping units. We have the single unit, a double unit, family units, and group units. And so then we have how the outside community approaches this site. They have access as well to the health center and social services. They have access to the educational facility. Most residents of Harlem Park have a high school education at most. This is a chance for them to get more opportunities. However, one thing that is important was the design of the courtyard. The residents of the neighborhood have access to public courtyards. The interior courtyard is exclusive to residents. They can invite other members in, but it was important to create a defensible space and to create a space where we had fronts and we could interact. And so I'd like to conclude with, once again, the goals of this project. This thesis was looking at how we integrate communities, how we can best bring aid to areas that are in need. How do we plant a seed? By investing in people and in community, we can perhaps better the environment. And at this point, I'd like to open to comments.
Actually, I have a question.
Certainly.
So I've been attracted to this thesis from thesis match. It's a really amazing topic. First question is, during your research, did you interact with people in Baltimore, neighborhood representatives, officials, and so forth, who are dealing with the problem of homeless? And the second thing that intrigued me was your reference to the Gabian wall.
Yes.
So those two questions.
Okay, certainly. So I spoke a little bit with certain community members in doing research. I also spoke with a number of the community development centers located in the area. I think there was the Northeast, and then I spoke with, I can't remember the group, but I did speak with a number of officials about what were the interventions happening near this site as well as in other places of the city. And so in some of those cases, what was being done was that there were small investments of where did they see opportunities, bringing in work, whether it was buildings for commercial, whether it was new housing, and so how they could reinvest. And so in terms of, to answer your question about the Gabian wall, in thinking about this idea of transition and this very liminal state of not being in one community or another, there's this idea of how we could represent that in architecture. And for me, that seemed to be a Gabian wall. So this creation where we have this rubble, these rocks from the site, from the buildings that existed, this idea of an old life. We can see through it, there's light shining through. So as we move through the building and we move through, so to show on plan, the Gabian wall occurs the length of the social services housing, and there's a moment of passing through the Gabian wall, past the entrance. And so,
Irene, you had a perspective of it, didn't you?
yes, I do. So the Gabian wall can in part be seen here beyond this wall, and then it can also be seen here. Let me go this.
So more detail.
Yes. So here we can start to see the Gabian wall.
How many families, how many units are there?
There are 75 units available. There are,
And the population would be at peak,
at peak would be 200.
200 people? And the general overall square footage of everything but the housing, do you know offhand?
I do know the basic dimensions of the site. I don't have the
You don't know
square
what the
footage.
program, I mean, so for example,
Oh.
the library is about how big?
Oh, the library is about 10,000 square feet.
And it looks like the social services center is a little bit larger.
Correct.
And then the school, I guess the education center, could you just say what's in there? What are all those program pieces? There's a gymnasium, I can see that.
Certainly.
What's everything else there?
So what we have is we have the gymnasium, we have a library, we have the auditorium, we have a number of small workspaces and classrooms. We have a large community room for workspace. We have computer labs, and we have other study rooms. We have a series of workshops, and then moving to the upper layers, we have, of course, the gym. We have some gym spaces, and then up above we have areas for workout, for classes to be held. And so the community can choose to use these spaces and say, well, I want to set up maybe a yoga class.
And what is that long bar just north of the purple stuff there?
Certainly.
Yeah, what is that?
Okay, so this is a roof terrace that stands above a common room, the daycare, and the dining hall.
Will you repeat how many units?
75. And
do
these-
is it your thought that they come and they stay for, is there a period, is there a, you know, a limit, yeah, to how much time they can spend there? And
Yes.
how does that work?
There is a limit of 2 years that residents can stay on site. So going back. Here we are. So looking at this period of time, I apologize for the quality, but for the first 2 to 4 months, residents come in, their situations are assessed, they are given a housing unit. From a period of 4 months on, residents go through case management, they are given a program based on their needs, so whether that is working towards a GED, whether that's taking classes on household and financial management, that will be assessed. Residents begin the program, their housing needs are assessed again. And so then through a period anymore of half a year to 1.5 years from that point on, the programs are continued. Residents are given the chance then to work on site, so whether they work in the incubator retail or they work in the library, they give back to the overall community of residents. And then towards the end, they complete the program, they've completed their series of classes or coursework, they receive a certificate, and case management and their case officer helps them find permanent housing.
Any idea how many of these Baltimore would need to deal with the homeless problem in Baltimore? I'm just curious, you need 10 of these or?
Yeah.
There's 2,000 people.
Yeah, if there's 2,000 people and these can house at most 200, we would need 10 of these. So if we could take 10 blocks at approximately 400 by 600 feet, we could house all the
But
homeless.
that's assuming that the homeless population replenishes. If you actually start to solve the problem, right,
True.
when people really transition.
And it also depends on the want to transition. There is, of course, the homeless who are happy. And the point of this thesis is for those who are in the position, and the point of transitional housing is for those in the state that they can't transition. There are, of course, those who will need permanent assistance.
The families,
Yes.
are the children placed in regular school?
Yes.
Or is tell me more about the education, is it for the adults there?
Certainly. So ideally, I see the education at being the high school adult level, because on-site, located within this block by Harlem Park itself, we have a middle school, high school, and elementary school already in place, and we have a fine arts school. And so I could see the opportunity where there's maybe a classroom or two that teaches elementary or middle school level for students who are maybe too afraid. People who are maybe coming from domestic abuse don't want their child walking those 3 blocks to school. So there is that sense of safety, but the idea is that most of the students would be going to elementary.
And who do you see as sponsoring agency?
I see sponsoring in part coming from, at first, government subsidies, looking at who we can have as investors, and then eventually through incubator retail, what we can use on-site, at least somewhat supporting then the rest of the running costs. I also see, depending on the level of need, in looking at transitional housing, some programs actually charge rent to those who are in a good place as a means, and those who can afford rent. maybe it's $5, $10 a month, but it's beginning to integrate people into, well, you're going to go back into versus society, you need to learn how to manage your money.
I want to commend you on understanding the program needs of this population. Having done one of these, with a church group being the sponsor,
Okay.
we focused a little bit more than you have on socialization spaces and how you create those amongst the families that are living in the center,
Right.
and how you transition them to be able to interact with the community and so on. So for us, it was very important, and I see that you've done it in certain places of where the community can interact more with what's going on. Actually, we ended up with much fewer residents and families, but more socialization type of spaces to have different levels of transition back into the community. And with the church being the sponsor, a number of events are held on a daily or weekly basis to serve the homeless who want to just come in for a soup kitchen
Right.
versus those who are here living, and types of activities of which there would be education or something that would be a community event of which there would be a new mixing. So there's the private socialization amongst those. There's those coming in from the outside who have a problem, as well as how do you bring everybody together in a very public kind of setting, all simultaneously on one parcel.
Right.
So,
And that definitely is a challenge. I think that was something I began to touch on at the beginning of this thesis, and in developing the rest of the program was lost a little bit. But you raise a good point, because this building right here is actually a church. So one of the things I had been beginning to think about is how then does the congregation after Sunday come out and interact with the site? Where might they come? Looking at, yes, there certainly could be more integrated spaces where they come together. I could certainly see the courtyard as being open to the community at certain points. However, there still needs to be that level of security.
It was more in the location of those being, the community type spaces being on the street. So you could come right into those spaces, no matter who you were.
Right.
But there was very protective areas as well simultaneously for those residents who were just not ready for that yet.
Right.
But at least two series of transitions across the whole thing.
And I would say that's what I was starting and trying to do. It probably needs another level of development, but the most public use of the space happen alongside the main roads, so that residential members can come in from the courtyard, and then the community comes in, and then these buildings lining the street.
So the larger courtyard is really just for the residents?
True, yes.
Now, I
Except
could
on
see
special
like,
days, right?
Except for special days,
Yeah.
I could see, 4th of July, people come in.
But the big room with the curvy wall on the outside?
Yes.
That's the day room where people hang out, or homeless can hang out during the day?
Correct.
Okay.
one thing you need is a foundation to buy up those houses that were abandoned and make them part of your thing. So there's a transition from being in there to being in. And that would diffuse it out into the neighborhood.
I think I wanted to congratulate you on taking on such a big item. I mean, for not just for Baltimore, any city. And I congratulate you on trying to look at the project in a way that deinstitutionalizes the total attempt of what you're trying to put together. I think the elevations begin to suggest an attitude about how it fits into the streetscape. But I keep looking at the court and keep asking myself about the different scales and the issues of privacy for people who are used to living in all communities. How do they transition to living in a multi-level environment, 4 levels with big glass walls? And how does privacy relate to that whole transition period for them? I didn't mean to keep doing it, but my eyes keep going to the big pieces of glass windows on many of the buildings, and I look next door to people who own properties, and there's a level of privacy that's implied by the size of the windows, by the communal spaces, and I wonder if at times this 4 levels of treatment with a penthouse implied on the top, you know, whether that's the correct vernacular for a transition role for the people. So I would like for you to talk a little bit more about how you see the environment, for instance, courtyard versus the environment street. And although you talk about it for the stoops slightly, that probably represents less than 1/10 of the total number of people who live in the project. The rest are dealing with stairways and elevators and you know, other challenges to how they've been used to living. So I think a little bit more attention to transitions within your project, even. Transitions of scale, transitions of privacy, transitions of community. You know, I find that aspect not pursued as much as others.
And it could be that that's something that you need a level of diagram in your diagrammatic models to explain, because I also think this is a really thoughtful and thorough project, and I think that we can all kind of pick out from your plans a reading of how you're navigating some of those transitions and different scales, and I actually think it's very thoughtfully placed in the city, and appreciate, from what I can kind of gather, the way you were thinking about variety of entrances, a variety of discrete programs that are recognizable as almost separate buildings. And I do think you're offering some of that variety, but I think if you created some diagrams explaining exactly how you were thinking about it, it might illuminate a lot more.
Well, I brought it up because I think the courtyard and the choice you made about a courtyard, which is a different kind of space than a street space, how you would take advantage of that difference in the transition.
But I agree about the comment about the neighboring houses. I mean, I think the next level, the kind of next stage of this would be, okay, can you think about it not as 1 of 10, but as actually, and not only a 2-year period, but how does it offer a sort of range of options that also lead into the surrounding community? So, for example, you might think about the scale of these incubator spaces. There's a project in Harvard, a kind of market space that was proposed under the bridge in Harlem that studied what's the smallest rentable market stall that could make it as cheap as possible for someone just getting started in an entrepreneurial venture. And then they moved from that kind of very small increment up to the kind of larger scale once the business is kind of thriving. So it would be interesting to think about having that kind of incremental approach to the incubator space, to the living space. You know, for example, if I'm making the move from being one of these monthly 75 units to needing to make it on my own, I might be interested in another scenario where I could pool my resources, still pool my resources with others, and rent or
Right, so
buy
take over one
a
of these.
smaller increment and say we're still going to share a kitchen, and we're going to share and we're going to use the daycare. So I think kind of thinking through those next scenarios, or even could part of the job training be in the rehabilitation of some of these surrounding homes?
I agree. I think that would be the next step if I wanted to take this project, would to see this as maybe the mother hub, where this is where most of the services happen. But then as we transition into the rest of the neighborhood, this is certainly a neighborhood with up to somewhere between 30 and 40% vacancy, maybe we teach the craft of rehabilitating these properties. And so as people integrate into the project, they pool their resources, their earnings, and they start moving into these properties. They share a property perhaps. Many of these row houses are currently set up as apartments where each level acts as a unit in a row house. And so,
to build on that, there was an article in the Washington Post just a few days ago that one of my students sent out on this very topic. Looking at rehabilitation of row houses in Baltimore and homes. It's like just I can forward it to you, so it's
Yeah, I would love to
perfect,
take it forward.
timely, it's really amazing.
Yeah, I think that, some good points are made.
Yes.
It's how do you make this into a residential scale? Because it comes across more strongly as an institutional scale. Size of windows, I think how you've done the three-story element though is the beginning of thinking about that.
Right.
But I'd like to see it
Scaled down.
scaled down quite a bit, actually. Even to the point of thinking about how you can individualize the unit itself, and then how you build up that scale. How the community could also interact with the child care center and become part of that. How all of these could be carefully thought about in terms of how much community interaction versus privacy is needed. So that whole issue of going from shock and being, feeling that you've lost everything, to
Right.
slowly building that confidence back up to then eventually move to opportunity. So,
Right.
Baltimore being a city of so many individual small houses, I would be curious to find out what you had with when you're homeless. Where would your first home be? Would it likely be an apartment, or would it likely be a small row home? And if you could predict where they would be going, I think your architecture would take on a way of teaching them how to live in that environment.
Right.
And I wondered that the implication almost is that their futures, and this may be true, their future is as a small room, multi-level building. That may actually be the answer. That may be the answer for the individual. That may not be the answer for the family. So I think separating those two and looking at where they'll go next and creating an architecture that teaches them how to live in those kinds of environments, semi-independent, would have been a good exercise to pursue as well. And I do think that would have implied bringing the scale down. I'm not sure that 4 stories, maybe being, well, they're not the biggest buildings in the area, of course, but maybe sticking to a scale that was likely the scale they're going to go into as permanent.
Right, rather than the scale of the apartment
Yeah.
building, the
Maybe.
scale of the town.
And that would just depend on what your research tells us, because you may be absolutely right, and I may be wrong.
Well, I think that's something I play with back and forth. In one version, I looked at perhaps some of the fronts facing onto Residential Street were 2 stories. It was a multi-level unit. That disappeared in later versions, but I think there is a play volumetrically of what is the scale. Are we looking at the scale of a 2-story home or a 2-story unit? Are we looking at the size of an apartment? Are we looking at the scale of a row house or a whole floor?
First of all, compliments on the scope of this, very impressive. And your explanation of the problem was really terrific. Across the street from me is a church, and I lived in my house for about 10 years before I discovered that they regularly had 3 to 5 homeless people living there in the church. And it was really great about it. I was very happy to find that out, because I would see these people a little bit once in a while. I just thought maybe they were working there. I found out they were actually living there, and the church would take them in, and they would stay there. And it seems to work just fine at that scale. I think one of the things that is the tension for me is the level of public and privateness of the courtyard there. And I wonder if you sort of continue along with Gary's saying, that if you sort of took the courtyard and said what they really need are smaller social groupings and made courtyards that might be appropriate to that, so 10 units around a courtyard or something like that, that would bring the scale down. I could even see a tall building like this if the social groupings were smaller. You know, so instead of a big courtyard, which I think for you, I get the sense that the courtyard represents this idea that at a certain point everybody comes together, and that's community. And that's good. That's a very, very admirable thing about the way you think about architecture, because I think what you're trying to suggest is the architecture facilitates the right kind of social interaction for people, and I think that architecture can do that. But I guess I wonder a little bit with the double-loaded corridor and the big building is if you just didn't, if you could just take one of the pieces out once in a while and design it, take the library out, or take the learning center out, or the homeless piece out, and say that the homeless piece went across the street. Could you actually make a building and a complex that had these smaller groupings of courts that would allow people the sense that they could take ownership of that space and interact in a way that was perhaps less public, you know? And I think that it would probably mean not including some of the program pieces that you've done to do that exercise, because then you'd want to kind of see how you could use that real estate to center the site to divide that up. One thing actually I should say you didn't mention was that when the city put those mid-block parks in Harlem Park, it was a failure.
Right.
It was a colossal failure, and those used to be small row houses in there, and they thought by getting rid of the social problem of those houses and making them public space that it would work, and it turned out that they became very dangerous and very problematic.
And
So the
part of it
idea.
was also that they didn't have money to maintain them, isn't that?
Yeah, but even
part
so,
of it?
the backs of buildings look into them and not the proper positive surveillance designs. So I commend you very much for trying to take something which is a systematic problem in Harlem Park and use it to create a virtue there. As far as the heights and things, I guess I wonder if actually some of the pieces might fit in a little less. I mean, for example, maybe the education center ought to have a somewhat more distinct character than some of the other pieces, so that their iconographic value to the whole thing was enhanced by that, rather than something that seemed to be created out of a row house module, which you do very well, by the way, in other places. But there, when I look at that, the educational piece on the corner, it leaves me a little bit sort of wanting to be something that I could look at and say, isn't that a cool building, you know, that's part of this whole complex? It might be a little bit different. But I gotta say, you know, it really, in a way, the other way you could have presented this was, I was interested in designing an urban block in Baltimore, which dealt with a lot of the sorts of civic and private things that this neighborhood needs. And that the problem of the urban block in Sandtown, Winchester, and Harlem, and Park, and things like that, is one of X. You know, these sort of big green space in the center, nobody knows what to do with. They need social services and things like that. So I commend that. It's a fascinating sort of dive into this problem of at all different levels, from what you provide in terms of civic buildings, what you provide in terms of amenities for people who are having problems, and also the kind of whole physical aspect of that neighborhood and what are the problems.
I think there's, picking up a little bit on Matt's comments, is thinking about this section as well, and how could multi-levels, let's say the bottom 2 floors, allow you to walk along a space in a comfortable area, but see what's happening, rather than having to feel you have to walk into that space.
Right.
And so think about the 3-dimensional qualities of still creating privacy, yet allowing the circulation that you need. And along that, you could begin to think about what happens as well, even as your courtyard space begins to think about different levels and so on. So it really is an indoor environment that's inclusive of a lot of different things.
I certainly think this project is a project continuing on, looking at the layers, looking at that porosity, and how do you create those views, that wonder, yet at the same time knowing you have access, or when you don't have access, and that privacy.
It's a very, very comprehensive look. My part.
Thank you very much.
Very, very comprehensive indeed. For those of you who have been listening to the extremely wide range of difficult issues that were brought up in this discussion, all of which have been grappled with in one way or another, there's one other one that Professor Bell brought up just a minute ago that I want to particularly draw your attention to. He sort of yearned for a couple of these uses that are identified with buildings to be somewhat more iconic in a certain way. And you didn't respond to that, but I want to respond for you because I know that you struggle with this, and I think it's interesting for everybody else that one of the challenges there is the conflict between trying to give identity to the place by making an architecture which is more, let's try and use that word, iconic, versus the risk you run in doing that by identifying it as a unique and different place and therefore potentially adding to the stigmatization that's already a burden for the people who find themselves homeless and feel stigmatized by that condition. And I think you made a very deliberate choice along that line to actually avoid that situation, to make this place less clearly identifiable in that, in that way. And I just point that out as an interesting kind of dilemma that we often deal with.
Well, particularly in a city that's lost its fabric, because most of this is building back fabric.
But it could be, but just one other thing on that, Steve, since I feel compelled to respond. It doesn't have to be the whole building. It could be a piece of the building or a piece of the facade that starts to do that. But in an interesting way, this site is large enough, it seems to me, to be able to accommodate lots of different imperatives along those lines.
Mike and I served on the committee together, so
I was just going to say that.
to say.
Well, let her say.
We Bluetooth one another, I think.
No, I don't think so.
Come on.
I think you've done a fantastic job. I think that the way you've looked at this, I think this last discussion here about how does this building take an identity, is this building not one identity, I think your personal experience certainly fed a lot into the way you studied this and the seriousness you brought to this and a perspective that is really required when you deal with a sensitive subject like this. I think this is something that our society in the United States has been ignoring for the better part of the last 30 years. And so the thoughtfulness by which you thought about people coming to this, as you said at the very beginning, this is a transitional period, right? You're not branded forever to be homeless, right? This is something that with some support and with some nurturing, and then you found ways to let architecture be that support and nurturing. Because we can throw money at this problem, we can throw social services at this problem. You basically said, let's throw architecture at this problem. And I give a courtyard here, and I think there's a lot of discussion here about the courtyard and the scale issues, which are all things we've talked about. But the idea that I can really imagine that courtyard at one corner is a young teenager pissed off at mom and or dad that they got them in this situation. And why am I not with my friends? And why do I have to do this? And why am I struggling with that? And at the other end is a mom or dad with their hand in their face in their hands, crying because they don't know where the next thing is going and they're taking themselves down. And that you've tried to wrestle that those different people, the parents beating themselves up, the children angry at the world, could all kind of exist in the same place, and that this building needed to be multifaceted to be able to achieve that. Shows a sensibility, again, amongst your peers, that you thought architecture can be there for those people. Architecture can let that person blow off that steam, get that self-reflection. I think that's a great thing that in your years of education here, both as an undergraduate and a graduate, that you found that architecture can actually help people in those times. I think is the most powerful thing that a student can get through this education, and to remind us all that architecture and the things that we do here aren't just about making great places and serving those that have the money to be served through architecture, but that architecture can serve everybody if we can just give everyone the pause to reflect on their life. So I've really valued the experience here in the last year. Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't have too much to say after that.
That's why I didn't want to.
Well, I'll say one or two things.
No, he didn't have anything.
No, I want to say important things. I think part of the wonderful thing about having having a committee is that each one of us brings different perspectives to the table, and at different times, we may be the right person to push the ball up the hill a little bit further. I guess I would like to pick up on one thought is the idea of empathy. And the idea of taking one's own personal experience, a difficult experience, and thinking about how that could lead one to become empathetic for other people, and realize one's not alone, actually, one's empathetic to other people who may be facing a similar situation. And then taking that empathy also, not just to think about people, but also thinking about place. Because just as we're thinking about the people who have lost their sense of place, we can think about this neighborhood and other neighborhoods like it, which have been divested of their sense of place and of value. And so I think a couple of comments that were made, that this could have been described as how do we take on this block, how do we think about this urban block, what belongs here, and in a way it was matched with the question of how do we think about these people, what do they need here, and how perhaps by bringing these together, we're making a transition both for the people and for this place, which we have seen in the last few weeks, not only Baltimore, but other places like that need that kind of thinking. So I congratulate you. It's been a pleasure working with you, and it's been a pleasure